So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about persuasion and ethics. We're going to be talking about how certain rhetorics, R-H-E-T-O-R, certain speakers engage with rhetoric, engage with persuasion. We're talking about some important historical events. So we've talked about ethics before. Remember that ethics refers to broadly the broad societal or cultural expectations of behavior, whereas morals are more individualistic, talking about where you come from in your religion, in your culture, in your schooling, in your education, in your parental situation, or whatever it might be. When it comes to ethics and persuasion, it's dealing with proper Aristotelian appeals, proper use of arguments, information, knowledge, proper engagement with the audience. We're going to talk about how a couple of speakers, two presidents of the United States, one FDR in 1941 and George W. Bush in 2001, dealt with this when talking about militaristic battles. So first, we're going to look at FDR's date of infamy speech. So this speech was presented after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th. This was presented on December 8th, 1941. I'm sure you've heard that line before, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. It's one of the most famous lines from a presidential speech. So we're going to look at that speech. We're going to talk about FDR's arguments justifying why America should be involved in the war, why he's asking Congress for a declaration of war. This was only the 5th time that America declared war on another country. The other times were the American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, and World War I. So this is the 5th and final time that America has declared war on any other sovereign nation. So just as a brief history of World War II, so Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939 with Blitzkrieg, which was lightning war, a new type of warfare. Poland sued for peace on September 28th, lasting a lot longer than a lot of people expected them to. Poland is not a militaristic nation. Germany had taken over a lot of Europe. It had defeated France, essentially defeated France, had set up a Reich government in France. Britain was saved by the English Channel. Germany did not really have a navy. They were a landlocked nation. They didn't really have a navy. And so they couldn't really get to, they were able to bomb Britain and London in particular with their Air Force. But the Luftwaffe, and they were able to attack Britain, but Britain was still fighting strong. So Winston Churchill on the victory symbol came in. It's where a lot of his arguments came in. And Britain wanted America to get involved because they knew that Britain wasn't going to be able to stand up against Germany. And FDR, historical perspectives are a little bit varied on this. There might be some indications FDR wanted to, but he didn't think America would go for it. America really didn't care about European problems up to that point. Just like World War I, they didn't really want to get involved in another European war. And even after December 7th, they didn't get involved in World War II in Europe until another event took place. So that's your question that's the first question for this video. What event took place on December 9th, 1941 that caused America to become involved in the European conflict? That's the first question I want you to answer on the discussion board. So we're going to go through FDR's speech after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, talking about some of the arguments that he made. So I have some arguments highlighted here. I'm not expecting you to read everything as I'm reading it, but I do want to focus on some of the important elements here. So FDR presented this speech to Congress. And a couple of things that were important here is that he begins the speech by talking about how sudden and deliberate this attack was. Naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan, recognizing that the Empire of Japan is a sovereign nation. It's not a few crazy people in Japan who happened to attack Pearl Harbor. It was the entire nation of Japan that was doing it. Now, there are a couple of important parts here is that there was communication. You can see here in the second highlighted part that there was communication between Japan and America about being peaceful. So a brief history about the Japanese and American relationship. They had been interacting with each other for a long time. I'm actually going to provide that history in just a second. So there was continued communication because Japan had been involved in war in the Asian theater, particularly with China. Invaded Manchuria, wanted China, and China, Korea, and Japan have had a long, storied militaristic history with each other. It's a fascinating history. It's a bloody history that would be interesting to look into on your own time. I just don't have enough time here to discuss what happened in there. But an important part here is that there was communication. China and America had an uneasy agreement, particularly because America had gotten a lot of Chinese immigrants. They wanted to keep at least a somewhat good relationship with China. Also, at the time, Great Britain owned Hong Kong, was in charge of Hong Kong, and America was allies with Britain. So there was this conflict of who was allies when and where. But there had been communication between Japan and the United States with the Secretary of State about maintaining peace between the two. So another important argument here is that FDR sets up what Japan had done. Exactly, this repetition was important. They attacked this place. They attacked Hong Kong. They attacked Guam. They attacked the Philippine Islands. They attacked Wake Island. They attacked Midway. There's consistent theme here. They're moving toward Hawaii and America. Another important part here is that FDR rhetorically places himself as the leader of the people. Now, inherently being a president of the United States, you were seen as the leader of the people. But in December 7th, 1941, after this happened, and then December 8th when he presented a speech, FDR didn't go on the phone lines and ask each American household what they thought about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. He didn't conduct a survey. So to say that the people of the United States has already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation, he is inherently arguing that the American people have already argued and agreed to war and understand the nature of this. So he rhetorically places himself as that. He's not saying, I am FDR, I want to go to war. It's, I am a leader of the people who want to go to war. The key word in this entire argument is the word unprovoked. And this is where the history of Japan and America comes in. So in the 1870s, Commodore Matthew Perry, before he was Chandler on Friends, he was the Commodore of the U.S. Navy. And Japan at that time was and always has been a sovereign nation. They were an independent nation as far as they didn't rely on other people for trade. They had their own culture, as they always do, on an island that does not have a lot of what we term to be natural resources, so things like oil and coal. And so they didn't depend on oil and coal. If you don't have it, you don't need it, you don't need to depend on it. And so Commodore Matthew Perry went into the Sea of Japan with his Navy. And I'm going to paraphrase the conversation here. Essentially went, hey, Japan, we like what you have to offer. We've learned a lot about you over the last few years. We would like to trade with you. We think we have things to offer you. And Japan essentially went, nah, dog, I'm good. And then Commodore Matthew Perry turned his guns on Tokyo and said, yeah, you're going to go ahead and trade with us. It's gunboat diplomacy. And so Tokyo began trading with America. And one of the biggest things that came out of that was the quote-unquote westernization of Japan, who became dependent upon oil and coal. And with the history of China, Japan, and Korea, and the militaristic ventures they wanted to undertake, Japan has, for a long time, at least modernly, been more of a militaristic power. They've just had a lot less people than China. Japan was able to use coal and oil to have a better chance to fight against China. So Japan became dependent on American oil. That's important. Before 1941, Japan had started invading China, started invading Manchuria. And with that agreement between Britain, America, and China, America didn't like that. And so America said, you're going to go ahead and stop. And if you don't stop, we're going to put an oil embargo on you. And Japan didn't stop. And so what an oil embargo does is that it stops the trade of oil to Japan. Well, Japan was dependent upon that oil. They could not succeed. Not only could they not succeed militaristically, they couldn't just back out. They also couldn't succeed as a culture anymore because they had become so dependent on American oil because of the force of America forcing them to trade. And so the Japanese, through various communique with Britain as well as with America, said, if you don't stop this oil embargo, we're going to retaliate. And so there was communication that they were going to retaliate. Now, did FDR or Churchill or anybody know what that retaliation was going to look like? Of course not. But there was going to be retaliation. It was clear that something was going to happen. Now, when I preface the rest of this argument, I want to make it very clear that I'm not arguing that any of this attack was deserved, or that American lives or anybody's lives should have been taken in this event, or that war is the right option. What I'm arguing here is that this notion of unprovoked is problematic. So continuing this discussion, there's a little bit of water between America and Japan. It's called the Pacific Ocean. It's the largest largest water mass in the world. And so there's a long way to go. And at that time, the technology wasn't available for planes to get over there in one day or in one shot. They had to refuel in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So America knew that the Japanese weren't going to make it in one day. They were similarly confident that their Navy could identify if Japan were to come attack the ships that would be in the Pacific Ocean. They felt comfortable there. Another reason why why America thought that Japan wasn't going to make it is because in order to do it, Japanese would have to fly overnight. And America, particularly the federal government, did not believe the Japanese could do it because they didn't think the Japanese could see at night because their eyes are slanted. Can we just sit for a moment and absorb how flippant absurd that is? That the federal policy, the federal position was that we are safe because the Japanese cannot see at night because their eyes are slanted. It's a bananas proposition. And so they weren't worried about it. Now, when it comes to the Pearl Harbor attack, it happened in the morning. They had to fly overnight. So it happened in the morning of December 7th. And there were various methods of engaging with that. The kamikaze bombings of the USS Arizona, which is still leaking oil in the Pearl Harbor. And at that time, the entire U.S. Navy was on Pearl Harbor. And that's not an exaggeration. The entire US Navy, all of the naval ships, the battleships, the carriers were on Pearl Harbor, all of them. It's not an exaggeration, all of them. America put all of their ships in one spot. They were so confident that Japan could not attack, and the Philippines were at least allied with us, friendly with us. Midway was at least friendly with us. Malaya was still friendly with us, that we weren't worried about someone coming to attack. And so all the ships. The only reason why the entire US Navy wasn't completely destroyed is almost by accident. A few ships went out on maneuvers that day, and that's what saved them. The rest of the US Navy was essentially destroyed. This attack by the Japanese was extremely effective. They knew that if they crippled the American Navy, they had a good chance of preventing America from becoming involved. America was already involved by sending ships and money over to Britain and France to help out, but they were not sending militaristic powers. So they wanted to prevent America, because America wasn't going to have a Navy. They didn't have an Air Force to get over there. It wasn't like you could just fly over the Atlantic Ocean every day that you wanted to. And so Japan knew what they were doing. It was very effective. So this notion of unprovoked is extremely problematic. Not saying that America provoked this attack or that America deserved this attack. I want to make that very clear. This notion of unprovoked rhetorically places America as innocent. And you will notice with any sort of politician or leader arguing for militaristic conflict or militaristic endeavors, they are always the innocent party. Every single time, 100%, every single time. And we can look historically as to who was the aggressor and who was not, but they're always, always the victim. Because if you were to argue, we love war, we love killing people, let's go to war, that's not a very effective argument. But if you can argue they have taken our money, they have taken our freedom, they have taken who we are. If you think to the Braveheart speech by Mel Gibson, they have taken who we are, they have taken everything that means something to us, our only choice is to fight, that gets us involved, that gets us enraged enough to fight. So if America were to say, well, we put an oil embargo on them, they said that we were going to retaliate, but we didn't think they were going to do it because the Japanese, they can't see at night. It's not a very, even though American racism is still alive and strong in 1941, it wouldn't have happened. So he had to rhetorically place himself as the victim in order to get this going. So that's where that positionality of setting that up, dealing with that situation is the importance of FDR's speech. For a presidential speech, this wasn't very long. A second question that I want you to answer is, what affliction, what disease did FDR have that made him be wheelchair bound? It's a disease that we don't really have around anymore. It was kind of eradicated until anti-vaxxers decided to try and bring it back. So what disease did FDR have that left him mostly in a wheelchair? That's the second question I have for you. And it's important because every time he presented a speech in front of Congress, in front of the American people, he always stood. It was extremely painful for him to stand. It was difficult for him to stand, but he always stood. He wanted to see that power, wanted a leader who could stand. Being seen in a wheelchair, unfortunately, at that time, as well as sometimes today, is still seen as a weakness, which is BS. So he wanted to be standing and be a powerful notion. Asking for a declaration of war is not something you do every day. So that's FDR. There's a lot more to this. It's easy to think back on, okay, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, we went to war with Japan. It's easy to see that 1-to-1 ratio, but there's a lot more involved in our involvement in World War I. The second speech I want to talk about is 60 years later, almost exactly 60 years later. After the attack on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the attempted attack probably on the U.S. Capitol building, George W. Bush, on September 11, 2001, George W. Bush presented a coherent speech, a complete speech on September 20th, 2001. He had presented speeches on September 11th and September 13th about these sorts of things, but he really presented a speech on September 20th after the 9 days of gathering information. And when I talk about some of I want to talk about some of the rhetorical positionings that he had as well, how he was able to justify and argue for militaristic conflict. Now, he wasn't asking for a declaration of war, but you'll notice some similarities between this and what FDR had to say. So once again, we're going to look at George W. Bush's transcript. This is just an excerpt from his transcript. We're not looking at the whole thing. It was a fairly lengthy speech. So we're just going to look at some important parts. I'm going to talk about how he rhetorically places himself. So as he sets up this speech, of course, he, at the time, he's kind of setting it up as speaking in front of Congress as, a State of the Union address. He says, presidents come to report to Congress, to the House of Representatives, to present the State of the Union, but this is an extreme circumstance. And so he highlights the importance of rescuers and workers in New York and in DC and Virginia and Pennsylvania working together to help each other, as well as across the world. He recognizes that the three major groups that are affected by this, the English-speaking people in America, Hebrew, which is Jewish, and Arabic, which is the Islamic default religion, as well as a lot of the other people speak Arabic as well. They're coming together, saying our prayers together. A couple of important points I want to highlight. It's clear what it is that he wants to do. in this line here. He sets it up pretty early on. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done. So the reason why it says justice 3 times. It's that repetition. It's that real thing. He's not saying whether we have to bring them to an area in America to serve justice or whether we take justice to the streets, justice will be done. And it's not militaristic power will be done or violence will be done. It's justice. So he sets this up as we deserve to do this because we have been attacked. And an important argument that was set up at the time of the 9/11 attacks was, do we see this as a crime or as an act of war? Because there's a difference there. Crime means there's going to be trials and punishment. War means there's going to be violence. And of course, those two aren't necessarily exclusive, but it sets that up. And what George Bush and his cabinet and other people saw this as was an act of war, kind of. It was an act of war, but not enough to declare war. And part of that was because it wasn't a nation. By acting a declaration of war is a recognition of a nation, which is why Abraham Lincoln did not want to declare war on the Confederacy in 1861, because if he did, he would recognize the Confederacy as a nation rather than a splint off of the United States. And so that declaration of war matters. You can only declare war according to the U.S. Constitution on a sovereign nation. So a couple of others to highlight is talking about who all was attacked. It wasn't just Americans. It was people who died with us, 80 countries in the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the plane in Virginia, or plane in Pennsylvania, other people who were involved here. And that this wasn't just an attack on America, it was an attack on the world. Further moving on, this enemies of freedom. This is an important argument, that this concept of freedom, we talked about it earlier when we talked about an ideograph. And an ideograph is a word that has multiple meanings depending on who you are. So the word freedom, we could all define freedom ourselves. And the example that I had earlier this semester, it could be educational freedom to me means that I get to teach the way that I want to teach. And educational freedom for you is you get to show up whenever you want. Those are both freedoms. So by saying enemies of freedom, we have this ideology, this ideograph in our hearts as to what freedom means, and now they're the enemy of that, which goes against the very foundation of what America is supposed to stand for. So talking about America has known wars. This isn't a new event. We have been involved in wars. We've been involved in 5 up to that point, and then other militaristic conflicts recently in the Middle East and the Gulf Wars just 10 years earlier. So this isn't new. Also identifying who Al-Qaeda is here in this highlight. So talking about how it's not just trying to make money, or it's not trying to just trying to get something done like the mafia is trying to infringe upon American freedom as well as Islamic freedom. This is an Islamic extremist group. So I want you to finish this analogy. This is the third question and third final question I have for you for the discussion board. Al-Qaeda is to Islam what blank is to Christianity. I want you to fill in that blank. So Al-Qaeda is to Islam what blank is to Christianity. When you think about that. So talking about what Muslim and Islam means, talking about extremism as well. Another important rhetorical position is this evil and destruction. Talk about advancing against freedom. Well, it's necessarily evil. It's evil and destruction, to plot evil and destruction. Well, who is going to argue to save Al-Qaeda if their choice is to destroy, and engage in evil? Talking about how important America is to Afghanistan. But they're not angry with the people of Afghanistan. They're angry with this splinter cell group, the Taliban, as well as Al-Qaeda within Afghanistan. Talking about how evil the Taliban is too. So we've decided, George W. Bush has identified the 2 evils, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and how we're going to go about stopping those. What's important here is this quote in green. This is extremely important. And I'm going to read this to you. The United States of America makes the following demands on the Taliban. Deliver to the United States authorities all the leaders of Al-Qaeda who hide in your land. Release all foreign nationals, including American citizens, you have unjustly imprisoned. Protect foreign journalists, diplomats, and aid workers in your country. Close immediately and permanently every terrorist training camp in Afghanistan and hand over every terrorist and every person in their support structure to appropriate authorities. Give the United States full access to terrorist training camps so we can make sure they are no longer operating. These demands are not open to negotiation or discussion. The Taliban must act, and act immediately. This is impossible. This is not possible. And George W. Bush knew that, and his supporters knew that as well. This is not possible. This is essentially a declaration of war. If you don't do this, we will fight you. That's extremely important. They knew that they weren't going to do this. It's like saying, if you don't give me all of your money, I'm going to punch you in the face. Okay. I can give you some money, but I can't give you all of my money. I don't have my bank card on me. I can't just go to an ATM. It's not possible. Now, the money one is a lot less violent than this one, but that's essentially the argument. Everybody knew that this wasn't possible. Everybody knew that the Taliban wasn't going to do this because the Taliban, at least at that point, lined up fairly decently with Al-Qaeda. And we still had limited knowledge as to what Al-Qaeda was and what the Taliban was, what they were doing, who they were, why they were. We still had limited knowledge. Another important part here is that George W. Bush specifically and explicitly addressed Muslims throughout the world. And he identified that it is not Islam that is the problem. It's not the Muslim friends, it's not the Muslim peoples in America that are the problem, it's in extremist groups. And what's important here is that George W. Bush did a fantastic job here. It's easy to look back on his presidency and find the issues. It's easy to look back on anybody's presidency and find the issues. But he did a fantastic job identifying this. Now, did it stick? No. Hate crimes against people of the Islamic faith skyrocketed after 9/11. At a discomforting, to say the least, level. But George W. Bush said, you are not the enemy, the extremist groups are. Another important part here is it will not end, it being the war against terrorism, will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. Well, that's also impossible. The war on terror will never end. It will never end because it can't. Anything we can identify as terrorism or anything a government defines as terrorism, that's justification to keep it going. And George W. Bush knew that as well as other people. This isn't a random or ignorant statement. They knew what was going on. So they knew this war was going to end. Also justifying, this is once again further justifying why we were going to militaristic or probably going to militaristic conflict in the Middle East. We didn't go into Afghanistan and Iraq until 2003, so 2 years later. But this is essentially saying, to drive Christians and Jews out of vast regions of Asia and Africa. They kill merely to end lives, but not merely to end lives, to destruct and end a way of life. And so George W. Bush's rhetorical placing of this is important. He uses this language effectively, and we can talk about ethics when it comes to how much he knew, and it's unclear exactly how much he knew. We knew that he didn't know as much as we would like to. 9 days is not enough to gather enough information to know everything, and some of it we could look at a comic perspective, comic not necessarily meaning funny, but comic as in, well, he was flawed, he didn't know the information, he did the best he could, or we can see it from a tragic perspective, which is he knew exactly what he was doing and he did it on purpose. That's still up for grabs and for political positioning. I'm not making a political statement to support his policies or not. What I'm saying is that through this language, through this persuasive speech, he used ethical claims and appeals to morals to engage in something. If he were to just say, well, this group committed this crime against us, we're going to arrest them, that would have been a very different argument. What's important as well is something known as the Patriot Act. So the Patriot Act, who's going to vote just on the name, the Patriot Act, but the Patriot Act essentially, it created Homeland Security and essentially said that America can tap into American phones and communicate anytime they want without a warrant. And nobody voted against it. Michael Moore has been one of the critics of that with his documentaries about reading the Patriot Act. But at this time, the world was on edge. I mean, yeah, it happened in America, but thousands of citizens had lost their lives in a terrorist attack like nothing we've seen before, nothing since the Oklahoma City bombing. Nothing had happened like that. And so this event really caused a shift in American sentimentality. And so it was this emotional action. The world didn't really know what to do. America didn't really know what to do. And so we needed action. So that's the rhetorical placing of these things. So it's important to recognize. Now, in your persuasive speeches, I'm not saying that you're going to be asking for a declaration of war or that we're going to be fighting terrorists. But you want to be aware of the language that you use. Doing your research is important. Doing research, understanding as best you can. You have more than 9 days to put it together for hopefully as a topic that's not as violent as potentially a war will be or that conflict in the Middle East will be. We have the benefit of hindsight now. 19 years ago was presented that speech, or 79 years ago with the FDR speech. We can see the issues that happened since then. And in the moment, you don't know those issues. With any policy, it's a guess. It's a hope that something will work. And so in your persuasive speeches, you want to be aware of those ethical claims and what it is that you were trying to get us to do or to think or to act or believe. So being aware of those things, understanding the ethics that are involved in persuasion, how to avoid improper use of ethical appeals, that's something that's extremely important. I look forward to talking with you. Make sure you watch this on time and engage with the discussion board post. Let me know if you have any questions. Make sure to turn in your homework on time. Talk to me if you have any problems. Set up a conversation with me, making sure that we're on the same page. Have a wonderful day. I will see you next time.